Welcome to the Dunelm Technology Podcast. Each episode we'll be looking at a different topic to do with technology. I'm Matt Brading, one of the principal engineers at Dunelm, and this week I'm looking at some of the news from the recent Google I/O Developer Conference. Now, there's a lot of news come out of the conference around AI. Obviously, that's a very sort of hot topic at the moment, and Google have their own AI solution in Gemini, and there's lots of impressive things that it can do and new features that it has. And obviously that's a very busy area at the moment. But the space that I want to look into is a little bit more mundane, but it's around the web platform. And that's the advancements that are being made in how we can write websites, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, the fundamentals of how we write websites. It's actually constantly evolving, and there was quite a bit of news coming out of Google I/O around that. Now, the first thing I want to talk about that they led their keynote about web technologies with is about the new baseline interop spec. And the idea of baseline is it's actually a coming together of some of the major browser vendors. So baseline has 4 core browsers: Safari on macOS and iOS, Firefox for desktop and Android, Chrome desktop and Android, and Edge on desktop. So those are really the 4 main browsers. Particularly Chrome, very widely used on desktop. Obviously, this was a Google event, so they were focusing on features that Chrome supported. But the fact that they were discussing this baseline interop spec meant that you knew, if they were talking about features, how it would apply to other browsers. So how does baseline work? Well, basically, there's sort of 2 main stages to know about. So there's what they call baseline newly available. So this is a feature, whether that's HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that's newly available, but it's interoperable across those main browsers. So it's supported in Edge, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari, but maybe only on a very recent version. So it might be a few months old. And then the other thing is that once a feature has been newly available for 2.5 years, it becomes widely available. So at that point, it's considered, generally safe to use. So 30 months, 2.5 years after it's newly available, it becomes widely available. And the relevance of these 2 points is that it allows developers to understand the features they're looking at, how widely supported they are. And the different ones might be applicable to different scenarios. So, for example, if I'm writing an app and I know that the users who are going to use that are going to be on very modern browsers, or I can control the browsers they're on, then I can use those newly available technologies quite easily because I know they're going to be supported. I know my users are on later browsers, so that's fine. If I'm writing an application that needs to be able to run across a large number of users with different ages of browsers, then the problem with the newly available is that whilst all 4 browsers support it in their new versions, the users might be running old versions that don't. So I'd have to consider putting fallbacks in place if I was going to use one of those features. So if I was writing that kind of application and I knew I had to support the general public running a wide variety of browsers, then I'd probably want to focus on features that were widely available. And what's nice is that, when you're going out, developers, when they're looking at these things, they often use websites like Can I Use and MDM, and both of those sites now support showing these baseline specs, and it'll tell you where the feature you're looking at, where it is. Is it newly available, widely available, or neither? Google have also introduced what they call the Web Platform Dashboard. So this is their own version of those platforms. And if you go to it, it'll show you the features that are in the different baselines. So there's baseline 2023, and that's for features that have become newly available in 2023. And similarly, there'll be baseline 2024, 2025, and they're also working on adding baselines back in time as well. But obviously the focus at the moment is on these new features. So if you go on the Web Platform Dashboard, and there'll be a link in the description, you can click on to baseline 2023, And you can see all the features that are in there. You can see that they're baseline newly available, and obviously that can change. And it also tells you the percentage of support that each browser has. That's how much each browser supports those features. Because obviously, a feature at a high level, it might require quite a lot of tests to pass. But you can dive into each feature and it'll actually show you, how implemented the feature is in each browser. There's a graph at the bottom that shows you, so you can actually see how the browser vendors have added support, and then when it became baseline newly available. And of course, once you know when it's going to be newly available, you know when it's going to be widely available. So you can start to think and plan those things in. Now, this is really, really powerful. This is an area that the web's been sort of sorely lacking for a while, is talking about these things. And the fact that the vendors are working together on this also helps to make sure that these features evolve together. So rather than Google and the Chrome team putting a lot of time into say one area, the Safari team going in another area, Firefox going in another area, and developers trying to run sites on that getting lost, there's actually now this sort of unified push to try and get the same set of features supported across the browsers, which hopefully makes life easier for developers, and it should also improve things for users. So that's baseline and the web platform dashboard. And now I wanted to talk about some of the specific features that they mentioned that I found interesting, that are coming to the web platform. And I believe all of these are baseline newly available, which means they should be supported in all the modern versions of the browsers, but some of them may not be. The first one that I'm interested in is responsive video. So for a long time in HTML, you've been able to have responsive images, and that's where you have a single image on the page, but you can set multiple sources for it, and you can put rules to say, if the page is wider than a certain screen size, show this image. If it's narrower, show this image. If it's small, show another image. And what that allows you to do is not only customize what image a user sees based on the screen size for aesthetic purposes, but it also means you can deliver smaller images, save on your bandwidth costs, speed up your app for the user. It's a really smart way of delivering images. But video hasn't had the same option. It's had the ability to have different video sources, and it'll pick the first one the browser supports. So that's in a situation where, some browsers support MP4 files, some only support WebM, and you can, supply all those options and it'll pick the one that's relevant to it. But it wouldn't consider the size of the user's device when it made that decision, which means that if you wanted to have HTML video on your page, then you had to provide one video that would work across all devices, which is obviously not easy. You end up having to provide quite a high quality video because you have to make sure that it looks good on desktop. That means your bandwidth costs are going to be high because you're streaming a lot of video. It means your users are going to be having a lot of data coming down to their device to view the video, and that might be wasted if they're looking on their phone. Maybe they're not even seeing much of the video. So this new responsive video option allows you to use CSS selectors to determine which video source to show based on media queries, so how big the screen is. So you could show different video to a mobile user, to a desktop video, to a desktop user, allowing you to save on bandwidth costs and allowing the user to have a faster experience, use less of their data allowance, and all of that good stuff. So responsive video, really excited about that. It actually surprised me in an extent that this wasn't here. Having not used the video element in a while, I had assumed that it was there, but the only way this has worked in the past is with things like HTTP live streaming, which is only supported on Safari. If you wanted to use that on other browsers, you'd have to use JavaScript and special media players to get that to work. So the fact that this is just going to be there in HTML by default in browsers, that's going to be great for developers, and hopefully means we'll get to see video being used more on websites. The next thing that's, again, great quality of life, this one more for developers, is CSS nesting. So what is CSS nesting? Well, when you're using CSS, you use what we call selectors to pick the items on the page that you want to style. And often you can pick a component. So let's imagine that we're looking at a website and it has a card component that maybe has an image in it and some text. Now in CSS, traditionally, if you wanted to style the border of the card component and then you wanted to style the text, you'd have to style those using different selectors. So you'd be saying, I want to style the div of the card, and now I want to style the text inside the card, and now I want to style the image, and each one of those would be separate, and you end up repeating yourself quite a lot. CSS nesting allows you to say, I'm targeting the card, and then within that, I'm targeting the text. It's somewhat hard to explain when you're talking, but when you see it, it's a lot smoother, it's a lot easier to read, it's a lot clearer. And this is a feature that's existed a long time in CSS frameworks that people use, like SCSS. In fact, it's one of the large reasons people use those frameworks. So the fact that now it's coming to vanilla CSS for everyone to use, that's fantastic, and that's going to make a lot of developers' lives easier. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the search element. So really a common feature in all websites is some kind of search box. So, you imagine most websites, you go on Dunelm.com, classic example, right there at the top, there's your search box. And actually HTML hasn't had a search element. So those are always forms that are appearing, and that means that the accessibility doesn't happen by default. We have to make sure that we apply the correct accessibility labels to those forms that are acting as search fields. So the search element in HTML actually gives you a semantic way to say this form is a search box. Now, it's not designed to be used with search results. Those are separate. This is designed to be used for the search box itself. If it shows sort of quick results, then that can be part of it. But when you hit the search button, that should take you to a separate page. So this is just for where you're typing in your search query. So again, that's useful, something that people should start picking up and using to make sure that their search fields have good semantic HTML and are accessible for all users. Another feature that's coming to CSS is user valid and user invalid classes. Now these are for forms. So if you're writing a HTML form and you apply some form validation, so let's say you've got an email field and you want the email to be required, then you can actually specify that in HTML and you'll get validation for free to make sure that it's the valid email format and that the user's entered it. That's existed for a while. What's also existed for a while is the valid and invalid CSS classes. So that means that you can style that input differently depending on whether the input's valid or invalid. So you might imagine that you put a green border around your email field if it's valid, and put a big red border if it's invalid. The problem that we've had up until now is that valid and invalid apply from the moment you open the page. So even before the user's gone to put in their email, before they've even clicked into the form, it's showing that red border around it as if they've made a mistake. And that's sort of a bad experience for users because they haven't even started interacting with the form yet, and it's already showing that it's invalid. So these new selectors, user valid and user invalid, they only apply at the point that the user's actually started to put in data. So if they go into the email field and type an invalid email, then it'll show user invalid, but it won't show that up until the point that they've actually interacted with the form. And again, up until now, this has required quite a lot of JavaScript work to get that to work. It's how we assume forms should work, but you haven't been able to do it just with HTML and CSS. And now you can, and that, again, hopefully means that we can make our apps, a bit more streamlined. We don't have to ship quite as much JavaScript with them. And that's kind of the theme of a lot of these things that I'm talking through. They're not necessarily new features altogether, but before they were only possible by writing custom JavaScript. And so the fact that we now get all of these basically for free in browsers It means we can stop writing so much code, we can stop shipping all that code. It just makes life easier for everyone. And on that note, one of the other features that they talked about was popover. So again, this is a common use case in the past where developers would go and get a JavaScript framework of some kind to allow them to have little popover alerts. So a classic example of this is, when we're filling in a form, it's got a little question mark icon and you hover over it and it pops up a little box to explain, what it's asking for in that field, what it wants. And those little popover elements weren't part of the HTML spec. They are being rendered and shown all using JavaScript. So popover is actually a native way now to show popovers in the browser, just using HTML. We have a very similar feature for modals. So again, if you click a button and it pops up a modal, that's been available in HTML for a while to be able to do that without JavaScript. But now we can do popovers as well, which are similar but slightly different, and they behave in slightly different ways. Now, all of the things I've talked about so far were out of the What's New in Web talk, and there's also a blog post that goes with that. So if you're interested in seeing more about those, about seeing some code examples, I would recommend that you go and see that talk. And there was another talk that I found very interesting, which was called The Latest in Web UI. So on a similar theme, talking a lot about what's new in HTML and CSS. And this talk started by talking about CSS scroll-driven animation. And the speaker used this phrase scrolly telling, which didn't really like the sound of, but I think we've all seen these websites where it's just one big page, you scroll down it and lots of fancy animations happen. The Apple website has a lot of this going on, and it's a very common theme in sort of modern product-focused pages. And again, in order to make those websites work, you've had to write a lot of CSS, use frameworks, it takes a lot of work, and you have to deliver all of this JavaScript down to the users. So now we have scroll-driven animation available in CSS. So basically you can say, I want this image to have, this setup at this point in the scroll, and then when I complete the scroll, I want it to look like this, and then it'll automatically animate between those two states. You can get more complex than that, obviously, but this allows you to do those cool scroll-driven animations just using CSS, and that's something that's really exciting, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot of that going on very soon. Another thing that was interesting is cross-document view transitions. So what does that mean? You might have heard of single-page applications. So this is where we have essentially the user navigates to our website and they're using a single application. Even if they're clicking between buttons on the site, they're actually just using the same application. You're not actually navigating. And this is called a single document. And for a while, there's been support for single document view transitions in the web. So a single document view transition is where you can say, my element is here. You just give it a label. So a good example is maybe you're on a sort of product listing page and you've got the thumbnails for all the products. And when you click a product, it shows you a sort of full screen view for that. You can actually tag that image with the same transition name when it's on the product page, and then when you're on the single product view, and CSS will automatically transition that image from where it was to where it's going to be. And that's been possible for a while in single page applications or single documents, but now we support cross documents. So that means if you click that image on your product listing page and it actually loads a new HTML web page, that you can still have those view transitions apply. Now this is another great feature, because what it means is you can start to get those slick transitions that people have come to expect from the web without having to deliver every website as a single document. And that should unlock a lot of power for developers. Things like, multi things like micro front ends, when we actually are navigating from one document to another, when we change page, we can now make that navigation look as smooth as it did, as if it was all a single page application. And there's some very cool stuff that CSS can do there. You can hook into these different transitions. You can see what page am I about to go to, and maybe you tweak the animation based on that. And similarly, when you land on the new page, you can tweak the animation based on where you came from. So there's a lot of power there. And I think this is going to be a really great feature and help us break away a little bit from everything having to be a single page application. The next large part of this talk was the speaker was talking about how they are getting to the point of being able to style our select drop-downs more. So this has been a common problem for developers, is that you can't really style drop-down selectors. And what was interesting was she was talking about the different standards that they're adding in order to get to that destination. So the popover API that I mentioned, that's a part of getting towards the stylable selects, because if you think about when you click on a drop-down field, what you get is a popover. It actually shows you the list of options that sticks out from the page. You pick what you want and it disappears again. So the popover API for HTML, that is a part of this. Another part is the anchor positioning. So what anchor positioning does is it allows you to position two elements relative to each other on your page, and it actually has quite a lot of flexibility there, and it even allows you to do some logic to say, say you've got the point you're anchoring to in the center and you want to attach to the right of that. If the browser window isn't wide enough for that to happen, you can actually specify an alternate position to put it in. So I think this is going to be very powerful. Again, should help us use less JavaScript. It should allow us to do a lot more interesting UI on websites. And finally, a few other things that were spoken about. So one that's probably the most exciting. Developers always talk about how hard it is to center content on a page. It seems like something that should be easy, and it has got easier in recent years with the addition of Flexbox, and you could use this align content property to vertically align your content. Well, now you can use that same CSS property without having to create a Flexbox, which is a very small detail, but again, this should make developers' lives easier, and they don't have to use all the power of Flex when all they want to do is just vertically center an item. So align content will be available in blocks. And then another quality of life thing is the light dark function in CSS. So most websites now, they have a light mode and a dark mode. People have come to expect that. And the light dark selector, the light dark function, allows you to specify two different values for a CSS property depending on whether you're in light mode or dark mode. So again, it should just make it easier for developers to add support for light and dark modes without having to get into very complicated CSS. Keeping on the CSS theme, we have the has selector, which again, part of the baseline newly available. And this allows you to select CSS elements based on their parents and relatives in the document, which is something that's not been easy to do for a long time, but now you can do that. And again, that should open up a lot of powerful new things. And finally, talking about CSS, I spoke when I was talking about video about media queries. So for a long time now, we've been able to apply different styles to things depending on how big the user's screen was or how big the browser window was, which was great for responsive design, but you could only use the size of the window as what was affecting your layout, which meant there was some limitations to what you could do. The new thing that's coming along in CSS is container queries, and this allows you to style a child element based on the size of the thing that it's in. So it's not dependent on the width of the window, it's dependent of the width of its parent. And that allows you to do a lot more responsive things, come up with some new interesting layouts without having to use, again, so much JavaScript. So I've run you through some of the things that I found interesting from the web talks at Google I/O. There's a whole playlist available on YouTube. I'll link that down below. It's called Web at Google I/O 2024, and they've got talks about all these different things, going into detail on some of them, and they also are covering different topics as well. So I mentioned AI at the start. There's a talk about how we can use AI in our development processes. There's another talk about different JavaScript frameworks and where the ecosystem is at with that, which is very interesting if you want to hear about where different frameworks are at, what the pros and cons are. There's a talk about preloading, again, a very interesting one. So I'd recommend, if you're interested in web development, go and have a look through that playlist and have a look at some of the videos that are there. But that's it for this episode of the Dunelm Technology Podcast. There are links to everything I've talked about today down in the description. And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.